Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you again for the invitation. So just as a quick introduction to where I am, I'm at UC Davis in Northern California. So this is near the San Francisco Bay Area and the capital city, Sacramento. We're also very close to several other universities and national labs, including Sandia National Lab, Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, Lawrence Livermore National Lab, UC Berkeley, and Stanford. So there's a lot of collaboration in Northern California between all of these national labs and universities. Okay, so I'll start by introducing halide perovskites and the machine learning approach to studying them. So the perovskite structure is shown here. So at the A site, there is an organic or inorganic cation, such as methyl ammonium, formamidinium, cesium, or rubidium. At the B site, there's a metal cation, such as lead or tin. Um, most most studies are still using lead, but trying to move away from that. Um, and then at the X site, there's a halide anion, such as chlorine, bromine, or iodine. So at each of these sites, there can be different ratios of those ions. So there's hundreds of possible compositions within the perovskite space. So perovskites have many functional benefits, such as a tunable band gap and high power conversion efficiency in solar cell applications. However, they're very sensitive to environmental stressors, such as temperature, oxygen, bias, humidity, and light. So these environmental stressors can cause degradation of the perovskite, and there can be several different mechanisms of this degradation. So there can be decomposition, degassing, phase transitions to non-photoactive phases. There can be segregation of ions or formation of defects or electronic trap states. So because there's so many possible composition combinations, as well as different degradation pathways, it's very difficult to study these materials experimentally because each composition might have a different degradation mechanism in response to each stressor or a combination of stressors. So um, we can use machine learning to study them more effectively. So they were first introduced as possible solar cells in about 2012, and there have been over 20,000 papers on this topic so far, again, due to their very high power conversion efficiency. So they have very high performance. However, the issues in the field are their reproducibility and their stability in response to these environmental stressors. So in the last few years, there has been a very rapid increase in applications of machine learning to study these materials. So the high dimensional hybrid perovskite parameter space, as well as lengthy testing times, will motivate the use of high throughput experiments and machine learning. So now I'll go over a roadmap for perovskite photovoltaics. So machine learning can be applied at each step of perovskite device development. So starting with the compositional screening, we can use machine learning to find the ideal composition for a desired property such as band gap. So in this example, they used X-ray diffraction and UV visible spectroscopy as training data, and the output was a convolutional neural network prediction of band gap. So this line is comparing training and testing sets, and we can see it has a pretty high prediction accuracy for band gap. So then the material level, which would be a thin film, can also be characterized and studied with machine learning. So in this example, photoluminescence and photoluminescence lifetime or time resolved PL are used as training data. And here we can predict the behavior over time of the PL of this thin film using machine learning. And then finally, at the full device level, the fabrication, processing, thickness, or properties of each of the different layers of the full device can be optimized with machine learning. So some figures of merit, such as IV or power curves, can be optimized. And then in this last example, this is the whole transport layer, and the whole mobility is optimized based on dopant levels and annealing time. So this is just an overview of some literature examples applied at each step of the perovskite development process. So next I will go over a project roadmap, sort of a workflow for applying machine learning. So first, we need to identify the materials question that we're trying to answer. So for example, are we trying to predict a figure of merit? Are we trying to forecast future performance? Or are we trying to find a hidden trend in the data that maybe we couldn't see otherwise? So once the question is identified, we must obtain the training data. So this step can be very time consuming because machine learning models need a very, very large amount of training data in order to make accurate predictions. So at this step, high throughput experiments or shared databases can be very useful. So once we have sufficient data, it must then be pre-processed. So in this step, there can be normalization, cleaning, or augmentation if necessary to ensure we have high quality data. So the next step is feature engineering, which depends on the model that you selected. So and the specific features you're trying to analyze here. So in this step, you would select and transform specific features to fit the model that you are going to be analyzing with. And then finally, you need to optimize and test the model. So certain parameters called hyperparameters will be that are not learned by the model during training will have to be tuned and optimized. And then finally, the model will have to be evaluated on unseen test data. So that's data that was not used during the training, it's only used during the testing, and then it will tell us how accurate our model is. Okay, so now I'll give an overview of some different types of models used in perovskite literature, starting with linear regression, which is probably the simplest machine learning model, and then moving on to some more complicated models. So linear regression is just a least squares curve fitting model. We're just fitting kind of a line of best fit. And in this example, the band gap of cesium-based perovskites is predicted with just a simple linear regression model. And we can achieve pretty high accuracy with just linear regression. However, some data does not follow a linear trend. It will need more complicated model in order to get higher accuracy. So the next type is a neural network. So here there's an input layer, a hidden layer, and an output. So within the hidden layer, there is some activation function So there's some calculations being performed here. And during the training step, the output is given to the model so that the hidden layer can adjust and optimize the weight and bias of its activation functions in order to match the desired result. And then once it's trained, it will be given the test data that it has never seen, and then it will give an output prediction based on that. So in this example, the potential energy of methylammonium lead iodide perovskites is estimated with an artificial neural network, and it's compared to a DFT simulation. So they actually match up very closely, despite the DFT simulation being much more computationally expensive than the machine learning prediction. So then the next model would be a deep neural network. So these can have up to thousands of hidden layers. There's no clear distinction or line between just a neural network and deep learning. But generally, these have hundreds to thousands of layers and can be much more computationally expensive. These can also have different structures. The the calculations can go in different directions through the layers, and they can be optimized in different ways, but they tend to have the same structure of input, hidden layers, and output. Um, so in this example, the octahedral tilt angle um, of perovskites are estimated with a convolutional neural network. Um, so another application of deep learning is image classification. Um, so this again has a similar structure to the deep learning neural networks, but instead of numbers, the inputs are pixels from an image. So in this example, the probability of perovskite crystallization is determined based on grazing incidence, X-ray diffraction images. And then finally, statistical forecasting analyzes past trends in time series data in order to make predictions about the future. So in this example, predictions of photoluminescence based on past humidity values are predicted for 50 hours into the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about this example in the following slides. So before I get to that last example, I just have a few more literature examples from review papers from my research group. So here, um, the long short-term memory model is applied to methylammonium lead iodide devices to predict their power output at unseen temperatures. So here the black lines correspond to experimental data. So it's these 5 different temperatures. And then the colorful lines correspond to augmented data. So that means these points were filled in with linear interpolation. And then the power is predicted at these different temperatures using long short-term memory, which is a recurrent neural network that processes data sequentially to learn trends. So this model has like a memory of past states. So it's very accurate at making time-dependent predictions. So at the time of publication, this example was kind of controversial due to data augmentation. So this practice is generally pretty accepted in machine learning, but for experimental um, papers and perspectives, they prefer like purely experimental data rather than augmented. So it is accepted in machine learning generally, but it depends on the audience and the application. being used. Okay, so this is another example of image analysis. So this is the whole transport layer of a perovskite device. This is spiro-omitad thin films. And here a convolutional neural network was used to analyze these dark field images. So 210 dark field images were used in this process with an 80-20 test train split. And here the error was only about 20%. So just visually, there's no clear trend between these images, but using the CNN, we're able to find that there is a trend in their conductance. Okay, so far I've shown some literature examples from review papers from my group. And going forward, I'll be showing experimental data and machine learning analysis that we did. So the goal is to predict and understand the effects of environmental stressors on degradation of perovskites using high throughput experiments and machine learning. So the experiments are high throughput photoluminescence. And here's a schematic of my experimental setup. So we have the sample chamber with temperature control. The perovskite thin films go inside the sample chamber. And then this sits on two stepper motors that are controlled by an Arduino. So the position of the sample stage can move in both directions. The excitation laser will hit one sample at a time, and then a spectrometer will collect the luminescence data. So this is meant to represent the computer collecting the photoluminescence spectrum, which is wavelength versus intensity. So we have direct temperature and humidity control. So the humidity is controlled with the flow of nitrogen through a water bubbler, and we can achieve relative humidity of about 5 to 85% and temperatures of 0 to 100 Celsius. And the sample chamber can fit about 15 1 centimeter thin films. So here's a photo of the experimental setup. This is on an optical table, so it's surrounded by blackout curtains so that there's no stray light or noise that gets through. So this is where the sample stage will sit. These are the two stepper motors. There's a series of lenses for the optical path, and then the spectrometer collects all the spectra. The excitation laser comes in through the side. And here is a zoomed in photo of the sample chamber with the perovskite thin films inside. So with this setup, we can obtain up to 2,000 spectra per day. So this is fully automated. We just start the code and then the chamber will move as it cycles through each sample while changing the environmental inputs. So for this set of experiments, we chose these 5 compositions shown here. So our collaborators at Georgia Tech fabricated this entire composition space where the A site is varied from Fa to cesium, and the X site is varied from pure iodine to pure bromine. So we selected 5 of the best performing samples based on their power conversion efficiency in a full device. But for these experiments, we're only testing the perovskite thin film. So these were chosen just to see some variation in both A and X and observe the difference between them. So those 5 samples were placed in that moving sample chamber. and the humidity was controlled in that experiment. Um, so as we increase the relative humidity from about 5% to 70% over 2.5 hours, the intensity of the PL spectrum increases throughout that time. And if we look at all 5 of the samples, we see the same trend in increasing of PL values with an increase in relative humidity. As we then decrease the relative humidity back down to less than 5% over the next 2.5 hours, we can then see that there's a decrease in the intensity. And then finally, the humidity is held at that low value for 1 hour, and there's no change in the spectrum. So we're going to assume that in this experiment, the humidity is resulting in changes in PL spectrum. So that 6-hour cycle that I showed on the previous slide was then repeated 18 times in this week-long experiment. So the cycle goes from 5 to 75 back to 5. There's a 1-hour hold, and then it repeats. So altogether, there's about 100 hours of data that are used. The initial and final holds at low humidity are not used. So here are the results of the maximum PL intensity throughout the experiment for each of the samples. So this point, just go back, corresponds to only the maximum value. So we're just tracking how much that increases or decreases. So even though these 5 compositions were very close together and pretty similar in their relative ratios, there's very different behavior across each of the samples. So some of them have just a very regular up and down cycle with humidity, while some have some very irregular long-term trends, especially samples B and D. There's a general increase over time in their PL values. So we are going to split this data into half training data and half testing data. And then we'll use 3 different machine learning models to predict their trends over time. So this is showing 6 snapshots throughout the experiment, all taken at low humidity. So these are all taken at less than 5%. But we can see based on where in the cycle it is, they look very different in their intensities. Some continuously decrease while some continuously increase over time. Okay, so the first prediction is made with linear regression, which I showed earlier, just a basic curve fitting least squares error fitting model. We're just fitting the A, B, and C constants here. So for the first sample, which had the very regular up and down behavior, the machine learning or the linear regression machine learning prediction is fairly accurate. It can pick up the up and down trends. However, for the irregular sample, for sample 2, which had an increase over time, the linear regression was not sufficient to picking up that trend. So that means we need a more complex model in order to pick up those more irregular trends. So the next prediction is made with an echo state network, which is a type of neural network. So the update function and prediction formulas are shown here. So this this type of neural network has a hyperbolic tangent update function. So that's what each of these hidden layers would be. And so during the training, those the weights of each of those are being constantly updated. But then during the testing for the last 50 hours of data, we can see that, again, it can pick up the regular up and down behavior, but it fails to predict the more irregular behavior. So even though it was accurate for the first maybe 10 hours, they diverge over time. So this model is still insufficient for picking up those irregular trends in the perovskite behavior. So the final model is a type of statistical forecasting. This is called seasonal autoregressive integrated moving average with exogenous regressors. So this is the entire formula. Basically, this takes into account the differencing orders as well as the seasonal differencing orders. So it takes into account the changes in slope over time, and how the average value changes over time. And then each humidity cycle is a season. So there's differences in each season as well. So this model is able to pick up the irregular trends. So it is able to learn from the first 50 hours what the trend will be, forecasting that into the future. So for these types of time series, time-dependent predictions, statistical forecasting seems to be the most accurate. So to summarize, all 5 of the samples and all 3 of the models, again, linear regression does an okay prediction for the first sample with the regular up and down behavior. The echo state network, again, can predict just the regular behavior, but the statistical forecasting can predict the irregular trends, despite each sample being so different. So again, we're comparing the color for each sample and the prediction in black. So the SARIMAX is the most accurate across all 5 samples. And to compare them, we used normalized root mean square error, which here's the formula for this. This is just a simple way of comparing the accuracy across each of the models. And for the SARIMAX, the average error was less than 10%. So here we can claim that we're forecasting the perovskite optical response with greater than 90% accuracy. So moving forward, this approach will be used to quantify the effects of environmental stressors on perovskites, and answer some open questions in the field, such as, are we passivating with trap states? Are we stabilizing an alpha photoactive phase? What changes are reversible or irreversible? And can the perovskite recover? So some previous papers have shown that if the perovskites rest in a dark and low humidity environment, they may be able to recover their properties. So we can add combinations of stressors, as well as more irregular inputs, and we can apply different machine learning models to forecast their long-term behavior. So thank you so much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions now.